So again, I'm recording this. This will be the second Tegrity file. Usually I don't have time to go back in to class Tegrity files and rename the files. I have renamed some that I've gotten out in other ways, but so they'll just be in there listed by date. But this will be the second one. So we're looking at what the virtue of a thing is, the word arete, and we saw that basically the same word can be applied, and was applied in ancient Greece, to an inanimate object that performed its function with excellence, performed it well, right? We said that we don't call a knife a virtuous knife, but we do call it a good knife sometimes. But, you know, the word arete can be said of something, of an inanimate object like a knife, that performs its function well, right? You know, similarly with a pen, right? I can say, well, that's a good pen. I just started using that and it writes well, right? You know, the purpose, the function of a pen is to write on paper, and that did it well. So the virtue of a thing, here we're not just talking about moral goodness, but we're talking about kind of an excellent, well-lived life for a human being. That's, you know, closer to the literal meaning of the Greek word eudaimonia, translated happiness. It's more a feeling of well-being. But arete, virtue, then, has to do with something fulfilling its essential function well. And so Aristotle thinks that many times the essential nature of a thing is bound up with what function it's meant to perform. And so he asks, well, wait a second, could human beings have an essential nature that revolves around their main function? And Aristotle draws a sharp line between human beings and every other type of living thing on the earth at the point of reason. It's okay, stay seated. I get paid to do this. Okay. I know, they left it locked, and I don't feel like calling over there and getting it unlocked. Okay, to get back here. And so virtue is more the idea of human excellence. A virtuous life is a human life lived well, lived excellently. And so what is a good life? What is the best life for a human being? Well, as I said, Aristotle, when he's talking about what's our essential function, says, well, okay, what's unique to us as human beings? There are some functions that we perform that we share with non-human animals and even plants, right? And I said, I used to draw this on the board, this diagram, but I think it illustrates very well what we're talking about. Aristotle says, well, look, what's unique to us as human beings can't just be having life, being a life form, because he says, well, even plants have life, right? And so do non-human animals. So you see, just having biological functions might differ, you know, might make us differ from a rock, but it's not going to make us differ from even plants for Aristotle, and certainly not for non-human animals. But now, in the next category, here's where the plants lose out. That is, unless you're talking science fiction, right? At the point of sentience, of having an emotional life, having a conscious life, being aware of what's going on around you. Aristotle says, we share this with non-human animals. Now, we'll see later, Descartes wasn't so sure. But, so he says that it can't be just having an emotional life that makes us unique as human beings. But Aristotle thinks the ability to follow out a theoretical proof in something like geometry, or to understand the steps in a philosophical argument, or to reason out what is the best, course to proceed ethically. He says our reason is what makes us unique as human beings. Now, later philosophers also agreed with him. Aquinas did. And that will be relevant next time when we talk about the design argument. Do things have inherent purposes in nature? And is our purpose bound up with our rationality? And can we draw a sharp line between human beings and non-human animals? After Darwin, the idea that there was a sharp line between us and non-human animals became a very blurred line. For Darwin, the difference between our reasoning abilities and those of, say, higher primates and other animals is a difference of degree, not one of kind. But for many philosophers historically, starting with people like Aristotle, reason is something unique to human beings. Now, why be moral? What's the purpose of ethics? Right? Now, as I said, we skipped over, just for the sake of time, because we lost a day at the very start of the semester. We skipped over a day, so I decided to scratch Aristotle's theory of forms. However, what Aristotle thought was that the ultimate standard of moral goodness was something he called the form of the good. It's an abstract standard built into the fabric of the universe. It's goodness itself. And, being good means approximating, the form of the good and knowing what the form of the good is. And for Aristotle, the form of the good is not something that is to be found in this world, but in an abstract world that is symbolized in the story we saw by things going on outside the cave. It is represented in his story by the sun in the world outside the cave. That is supposed to represent the chief form, Aristotle's, or rather Plato's form of the good. Now, Aristotle did not think that the forms existed in a separate world, but only in particular things. And so there is no abstract standard for ethics for Aristotle, like the form of the good. And so And by the way, you can say, well, wait a second. If the sun outside represents the form of the good and not the sun, what represents the sun in Plato's story? Well, things in this world, the world our senses perceive, for Plato, are inside the cave. And so the fire in the cave represents the sun in this world. But the sun in the story represents something else. The sun outside the cave represents the form of the good. Now, I'm not going to ask you a lot of particular questions that have to do with Plato's theory of the forms because we skipped over that. But I'm trying to put things in a little bit of a context, give you a little bit of background. The point is, for Aristotle, or Aristotle's much more practical when he comes to discuss the ultimate standard for moral goodness, the ultimate goal of ethics. For Aristotle, it's basically happiness in this life, or the word is eudaimonia, which we translate happiness, but it's more than that. It's more like satisfaction with living an excellent life, a well-lived life, you know, and so for Aristotle, it's what we want to achieve. And he says happiness is the standard we ought to aim for. And this is in the pages assigned to you. When I've taught specific ethics courses, I've spent much more time on why Aristotle chooses happiness. But basically, he thinks that it's the one thing that we desire for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. That it's the one good that is desired for its own sake. And one of my textbooks in ethics used to illustrate things this way. I could say, you know what, it's good for you to eat healthy foods. And somebody might want to say, why is it good for you to eat healthy foods? And you might say, well, someone who eats healthy foods is going to basically be healthier than themselves. That is, the good of eating healthy foods promotes the further good of good health, right? But if you go on to say, well, why should we care so much about being healthy? Now, there are a number of ways you can answer that, but one way is to say, well, you know what? Healthy people generally enjoy life better. Healthy people are happier people. Life means more to them. But if I then go on to say, but why be happy? Well, for Aristotle, the buck stops there. Happiness is not some good that is pursued. The word is instrumentally, but I'm not going to ask you that. Only because it promotes some other good. But happiness, he says, is pursued for its own good, for its own sake. And that's what you want as an ultimate standard of morality, something that is good for its own sake, not just a good that promotes some other good. Now, what he says is, if we act in accordance with virtue, that is, we use our reason to follow the mean, right, to follow the midpoint, often against nature, then that's the way we're going to be happy. Activity is, you know, living in accordance with virtue. And so, in other words, we might not want to go in and confront our boss about a raise, even though the person working next to us doing the same thing just got a raise. Why am I not getting one? but I'm saying, you know, I really need to develop courage. And so we fight against our impulses because our reason tells us you need to go in and, you know, diplomatically approach your boss about this raise. So it's our reason that enables us to do the courageous thing. Not to have no fear, but to face our fear and deal with it. Likewise, I mean, if we're developing self-control, say in the area of sweets, it's by our reasoning that we say, okay, I know I want to go back to the refrigerator and have another piece of that cake, but I'm trying to develop more self-control in this area of my life, and rationally I decide, no, I'm not going to do it, right? So it's by using our reasoning abilities, for Aristotle, that we live the virtuous life, that we're able to walk the mean between these extremes. And so for him, the virtuous life is also the happiest life, which is a life of moderation. Virtue is walking the moderate mean between extremes. And the happiest life is a virtuous life. So the happiest life is basically a moderate life for him. Now, there are some problems with drawing a sharp line between us and everyone else at the point of reason. Really, Plato and Socrates viewed the rational part of us as the part that is most godlike, right? It is our reason for Plato that puts us in touch with the ideal natures of things in another world, along with goodness itself. And so the soul, its chief, highest function is the reasoning function for Plato. Now, the point is, reason then is that part of us that is most godlike, the part that has to do with our lower appetites or with our emotions, for him is not the highest, most godlike part. Well, one of the controversial things about Aristotle's philosophy is that Aristotle takes this a step further. And while Greeks we saw Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle's day condone slavery, right? You don't see Socrates lecturing Meno on the evils of being a slave owner. It's just understood, right? It was a slave boy who Socrates was questioning. And the thing is, Aristotle says, you know what? It's in the nature of things that the more rational should rule over and govern the less rational. And the gods are more rational than we are. So it is in the nature of things that the gods, plural, right, the Greek pantheon, the gods should rule over us as mere mortals. But then Aristotle extends this and asks, well, are there classes of people in this world, among humans, that are more rational than other groups of people? Now, remember, the Greeks invented the word barbarism and barbarian. I like one of my old favorites, that Arnold Schwarzenegger was Conan the Barbarian, right? So anyway, let's not get off on that. But it's the Greeks who invented the word. Talk about Arnold, right? I'll be back, right? I used to have a answering machine message. No, let's not go there. Anyway, that was humorous. But the Greeks invented that word because they said, hey, look, we're Greeks. We're intellectually superior to all these barbarous nations around us, you know? And the point is, and what is a real negative implication of that, is they thought, well, in the natural order of things, the more rational was meant to rule over the less rational. So we as Greeks are morally justified in conquering and ruling over and even enslaving a less rational group of people. So that's, you know, this is one of the arguments that comes down to us that we look at and we say, this is a horrible argument, Aristotle. What were you thinking when you thought that you could provide a moral justification for slavery this way? But even today, the idea of using reason to define our humanity is controversial. Think about it. These discussions come up in things like medical ethics. Is a newly born infant, do they have full reasoning powers? No, they're not as rational as you all are because you're, you know, adult men and women. So does that mean that somehow a newborn infant is less human than you are right now? And what about somebody at the end of life who has Alzheimer's and has lost the ability to fully reason? Does that mean they're somehow less human? In my day, there was a book called Situation Ethics written by Father Joseph Fletcher. He went into medical ethics later in his life. I saw a video where he argued that an infant with Down syndrome is not fully human because they're not fully rational. You know, so this is a very controversial, you know, thing. And so I just pointed out here because it's controversial the way Aristotle used it, but even in contemporary ethical discussions, this issue comes up of whether we need to tie our humanity strictly to our rationality, you know. But there are problems with going the other way, too, you know. There are animal rights activists who say, well, you know, non-human animals have the same rights as we do because there's only a difference in degree, not in kind, between us and them. You know, so there are issues both ways. Anyway, so for Aristotle, the happiest life then is the virtuous life. Virtue is its own reward. Both Plato and Socrates were really concerned to do the right thing in this life because they thought somebody would fare better in the afterlife if they did do that. You know, that's why Socrates in the Crito says, hey, look, I'm going to get this right as to whether or not it's morally the right thing to accept your offer to, you know, bust me out of jail here, you know, because Socrates says I may harm my soul in the afterlife if I don't get this right. So he tries to think it through. Aristotle doesn't seem to have necessarily even thought there was an afterlife. So he was worried about whether ethics can be, you know, can benefit us in this life. Okay, well, that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to start this video. No, I'm not